Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome back onto the podcast Susan Abernethy to discuss her brand new book, The Formidable Women Who Shaped Medieval Europe, Power and Patronage in the Burgundian Court. Susan's passion for history dates back 50 years and led her to study for a Bachelor of Arts degree in history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is currently a member of the Rocky Mountain Medieval and Renaissance Association, the Historical Writers Association, the Society for Renaissance Studies, and the Historical Association. Her work has appeared on several historical websites and in magazines and includes guest appearances on historical podcasts and YouTube videos. Her blog, The Freelance History Writer, has continuously published over 500 historical articles since 2012, with an emphasis on European, Tudor, medieval, Renaissance, early modern, and women's history. Welcome back to the podcast, Susan. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm excited for today because we are discussing your second novel, The Formidable Women Who Shaped Medieval Europe, Power and Patronage at the Burgundian Court. But before we get onto the book, I thought we could discuss a little bit about you, and I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Sure. When I was a teenager, there was a program on TV called The Six Wives of Henry VIII, and with Keith Michelle, and he was really fantastic. I think he was Henry. But I was just so stunned by, here's a man that married 6 times and he cut off the head of 2 of his wives. And I was just, I thought this is stranger than fiction. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on about history, about Henry VIII and his wives. And then that expanded into his children and Mary, Queen of Scots, and so on and so on. And so by the time I was ready to go to college, I said, well, I have to major in history. So that's what I did. And then I promptly went into the mortgage business for about 25 years. But during all that time, I read biographies and history books and I called it my hobby at that time. And once I retired, I decided to start a blog. So my blog, The Freelance History Writer, has been up and running since 2012, and there's over 500 articles on there, mostly about early modern medieval history. I really love English and French history, and also I decided to kind of concentrate on women's history. So that's what I've been doing, and then that morphed into writing some books.
So your first book was about Catherine of Braganza, Charles II's wife. How did you come to this topic for your second book?
Well, a long time ago, I went to the bookstore and I found a used copy of a biography of Isabel of Portugal. And because of my love of the history of France, I thought, well, this looks kind of interesting. And it turned out that at the age of about 33, I think, she married Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. And I had sort of heard a little bit about Burgundy, off and on in studying English and French history. But when I started reading about her and her son, Charles the Bold, I just couldn't get over how powerful and assertive these people were. And so then I started reading Richard Vaughan has 4 biography series of the 4 Dukes of Burgundy. And so I started reading those. And I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. There's there's battles, there's marriages, there's just so many, and they all had many wives, and it's just really fascinating history. And a lot of it is northern France and the Low Countries, and a little bit of the German Empire too. So it's a little bit of everything, and it's fascinating.
Could you tell us a little bit about the formation of the Burgundian Empire? Because I don't think a lot of people know about Burgundy, do they? As you were saying.
No. Yeah, that's another reason I wanted to write the book, is because I would like for people to learn about this empire. In the ancient times there was a Burgundian kingdom actually at one point, and it sort of morphed into different areas of France and parts of Italy, parts of Germany, and eventually it ended up being a dukedom. And when King John II um, fought in the Hundred Years' War. He was held captive by the English, and with him came his son Philip. And when they were released, his father wanted to give him something, in appreciation for how he fought boldly in battle and stood by his side. And so, at first, he gave him the Duchy of Touraine, but eventually Philip transferred that into the Duchy of Burgundy. And then he decided he wanted to merge that with what was called the Franche-Comté, or the County of Burgundy, which is in northern France. And to do that, he would have to marry the daughter of the Count of Flanders, because she stood to inherit that. And so that's how you got Philip the Bold, who married Margaret of Maille, who was the Countess of Flanders. And that's where it started. And then he ended up bullying and badgering his way in many different ways, bullying women to get their patrimonies, going to war, purchasing certain counties, this kind of thing. And so at the point of when Charles the Bold inherited, it was about the size of England and Wales combined.
So, in the book, you had a chapter about the female ancestors of the Burgundian Empire. Could you tell us a little bit about who they were?
Yes, I was shocked when I was looking at a family tree. And it turned out that um, Margaret of England, who was the daughter of King Edward I, had married the Duke of Brabant. And so it was through her son and then her grandchildren, that you have Margaret of Maille. Was One of her grandchildren was Margaret, Countess of Flanders, and then her daughter was Margaret of Maille. And so that was the ancestor on that side. Um, and then the other one was the Margaret of uh, Brabant, the Countess of Flanders, which was her granddaughter. Um, she married Louis of Maille, and then she was the mother of Margaret of Maille, who married Philip the Bold. So those are a couple of the women that I have in there.
So, you previously mentioned Philip the Bold. So, would you like to tell us about Margaret of, is it Mayle or Marley?
Maille,
Mayle.
yes,
She's the matriarch, isn't she, really, of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy?
yes, that's true. She's called Margaret of Maille because she was born in the Castle of Maille in Flanders. Um, and she was the only child, and she stood to inherit Flanders, Nevers, Rethel, part of Antwerp. She just had, all these properties that she was going to inherit upon the death of her father. And so that was one of the reasons that Philip the Bold was interested in her and married her, so he could combine his duchy with her properties too. And that was the start of the Burgundian Empire.
How did she show her power? Because obviously she was formidable on in her own right, wasn't she?
Yes, she was, because she owned all these Flanders and Rethel and Nevers and the French Comté. And so what Philip did is he trusted her implicitly. And so he allowed her to basically rule her part of the inheritance while he was off in France trying to get the throne of France, or, rule France, while his nephew, King Charles VI, suffered from mental illness. So she pretty much ran a lot of the empire while he was away.
How did she obviously like ruling your husband's estates was a very big task. How did she get the respect of his noblemen to treat her with the same respect they would treat her husband with?
Well, as far as like her properties, Flanders, Rethel, Nevers, all those French Comté, those nobles would have looked to her as their leader, as the person that they owed fealty to. So she didn't have much of a problem with that because they listened to her because she was the owner of the properties.
Can you tell us about her daughters and the impact they did and their legacy as well?
Yes, the first daughter, Margaret, married the Count of Holland, Zealand, and Hainaut, and um, which was a huge amount of property. And I think that Philip the Bold married her to this count to get, eventually get her properties into the Burgundian Empire. And she was a really formidable person. Her and her husband didn't get along very well. He had a mistress, he was away a lot. And she didn't actually have a child until many years into their marriage. And that child was Jacqueline of Bavaria, which she had a very fantastic story too. She's in the book too. Um, and so that was one of the reasons that Philip the Bold married her into that family. Um, Perhaps my favorite daughter of all the ones, actually, she's one of my favorite in the whole book, was Catherine of Burgundy. And Philip married her to Leopold IV, Duke of Austria, when she was fairly young. And then her parents kept her in Burgundy for a while, and eventually she got to go to Austria. But what happened was Philip the Bold failed to pay her dowry, which is kind of mean. And so I think Catherine had a lot of charisma. And she went to her husband and she said, "Will you please give me, the county of Ferret so that I can get the income from that and I can rule that?" And he said, "Sure." So she ended up becoming the ruler of this county. I think it's part of Switzerland now, part of Germany and Switzerland. And she was very good at her job. She cultivated a lot of the noblemen. She acted as a diplomat for her father and for her brother, John the Fearless. Um, she started a few petty wars while she was running this little county. Um, I've never seen anything like it. But the best part of the story is there was an Austrian nobleman named Maximilian Schmassmann, and he had actually worked in the court of her father and her brother. And she fell in love with him. I bet he was really handsome. And she actually married him because she needed to cultivate, the nobleman, and she needed to have power and an army. And she married this guy. And John the Fearless got a letter from someone that said, "Did you know that your sister married Smashman?" And he had no idea that she had done this. And noble women, just didn't do that. They were under the power of their father or their brother, and she probably should have gotten John's approval, but she didn't do that. But John just kind of said, "Oh, well, just come back to Burgundy." He didn't argue that she wasn't married or whatever, that she was married. It was just like, come to Burgundy. And eventually um, her nephew Philip the Good decided that he didn't want her to be married to this guy, and he wanted Ferret for himself. And so kind of forced her to annul the marriage. And it was really sad because after that, she kind of lost her will to live, and she died shortly thereafter. But I just think it's a fantastic story. I've never seen any medieval woman like her.
No, she sounds incredible. I mean, for your brother to go, I won't argue with that decision actually, because I don't want to face the repercussions. I think that's quite funny.
Right, right. But actually, at that time, I read a little bit about marriage at that time, and noble women were starting to kind of assert themselves, and say, hey, I don't really want to marry this guy that they were trying to marry somebody to for whatever political reasons. And so it probably wasn't unusual for that to happen at that time. Yeah.
Would you tell us about Joan, Duchess of Brabant?
Yes. And now I mentioned Margaret, Countess of Flanders, who was Margaret of Maille's mother. Her sister was Joan. She was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Brabant, and she ended up marrying Wenceslas, who was the Count of Luxembourg. Actually, he was later made the Duke of Luxembourg. And she was definitely a formidable woman because the people of Brabant really respected her a lot. And when her husband was kind of going off to war, and it was mostly defensive purposes because people were trying to attack her properties because it was a woman, of course, that was ruling, so that made it look weak. The properties look weak, but and she also had a court that was very artistic. She was a poet herself, and she had a choir. Her court was known for artistic and culture. And also, they had some woods that they would hold a lot of tournaments in. So a lot of the nobles would come there and participate in tournaments. I mean, it was really great. Now, she did have one little flaw. She liked to gamble. She really liked to gamble. And so she would end up, you know, in debt. And eventually, after her husband died, she had to go to war with the Duke of Guelders, and she needed money and she needed troops. So she went to her nephew and said, hey, I need some help. And of course, he extracted a promise from her that she would make him her heir for all of her properties. So, yeah, she was great. And for a while there, she would like ride in front of her troops on horseback. She didn't participate in battle, but she would go in front of her troops. And I think this is great because it probably helped the morale of the troops. By the time she was in her 80s, she was suffering from dementia, and she eventually died. She was the last of the Regenar dynasty of Brabant. And Brabant, by the way, is what we call Belgium now.
That's cool. I never knew that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us about Margaret of Bavaria, the Duchess of Burgundy, obviously, and who was she and how was she formidable?
She was the daughter of a count of Holland, and her mother was a Polish princess, and she had genetic ties to many of the noble houses in Europe. And when Philip the Bold was negotiating marriages for his daughter Margaret and for his son John the Fearless, he was looking to that area to make some marriages. And um, Margaret's mother said, if my son can marry into the Burgundian family, why can't my daughter marry into the Burgundian family? She kind of insisted. And Philip the Bold didn't really like the idea because he wanted to marry his children into the royal house of France. But eventually he gave in, and Margaret married John the Fearless when he was still Count of Nevers. Now, what I find fascinating is that she was 22, he was 13. And so I'm kind of getting a Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon vibe with this. And so I just find that fascinating. And she just lived at the Burgundian Court after the marriage until he came of age. And then he went off to Turkey in the Balkans and went to, war, crusade. But she stayed home and she ended up having several children, including Philip the Good. But she also helped John the Fearless rule in Burgundy while he was away in France. And she kind of followed in the same pattern as Margaret of Maille and looked after a lot of all the other territories, his territories.
Now, you just mentioned the age gap between her and her husband. Did they have to wait until he was 16 to become a full relationship?
Yes, yes. Probably maybe 14 or 15. Then they could start having relations. Mhm.
Could you tell us about her daughters?
Yes, she had some fascinating daughters. The first daughter actually made a marriage to the Dauphin of France. This was Louis of Guyenne. He was the son of King Charles VI. Um, Unfortunately, it didn't turn out so well because John the Fearless created kind of a crisis by having the people of Paris revolt. And during this revolt, Margaret, Margaret's daughter, and Louis of Guyenne, their home was invaded by the rebels. And I'm sure she was scared to death. I think they even tore some servants out of her arms and that kind of thing. And so Louis of Guyenne did not really appreciate John the Fearless from that point forward. And so he took a mistress. He eventually just sent her away, and she ended up getting the marriage annulled and she went back home. And then she ended up marrying the Duke of Brittany. Um, Her second daughter, Mary of Burgundy, married the Duke of Cleves, and she had several children. Her legacy was mostly with her children and the marriages that they made. And two of her daughters, which we'll discuss a little bit later, um, married into royalty, which was kind of interesting. Also, one of her daughters was Anne of Burgundy, and she married the Duke of Bedford, who was the brother of King Henry V of England, and he acted as his regent in France. And so this was actually a pretty good marriage. They enjoyed each other's company and she traveled around with him. Unfortunately, she didn't have any children and she ended up dying of the plague at a pretty young age. But as a side note to that, the Duke of Bedford ended up marrying Jacquetta of Luxembourg as his second wife. And she's the mother of Elizabeth Woodville, who married King Edward IV. Don't you just love all these relationships? I think they're great. And lastly, her youngest daughter, Agnes of Burgundy, married the Duke of Bourbon. And oh, she had so many children. And her nephew, Philip the Good, married all of her children into all these different houses, royal houses in Europe. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of those too.
You mentioned Philip the Good earlier, and I noticed in the book that he has quite a few wives. So his first wife was Michelle of Valois. Could you tell us a little bit about her?
Yes. Um, this is another cool relationship. She's the sister of Catherine of Valois, who was the wife of Henry V of England. She was her younger sister. And unfortunately, Michelle didn't live very long, but they did have a very good relationship. Um, and she didn't have any children. So Philip was a widower after her death. And then he ended up marrying a woman who had married one of his cousins, Bone of Artois. Um, and she did not live long either. I think they were married for less than a year, and she didn't have any children. She was praised by the historians for being beautiful and very religious, and She didn't wear fancy clothes and she didn't drink wine, and she was praised for these things. And then, and Philip had decided that he might marry Isabella Portugal shortly before he married Bone of Artois. But one of his relatives, Amadeus the Eighth, Duke of Savoy, convinced him to marry Bonn. But after Bonn died, Philip brokered this. I mean, it was really a big deal that he married this Princess of Portugal, Isabel. It sort of made Burgundy, put Burgundy on the map as a international country.
Now, I'm sure he didn't, but he didn't kill any of his wives, did he? Just making
No,
sure.
no, I know it kind of has a Henry VIII vibe, doesn't it? Yeah,
just making sure, just double check.
right.
Could you tell us a little bit about the granddaughters of John the Fearless?
Yes, one of them was Catherine of Cleves, who was the daughter of Mary of Burgundy, Margaret of Bavaria's daughter. She married the Duke of Guelders, and she had a really interesting relationship with her husband. She kind of felt like she had married beneath herself by marrying this duke. Um, and she had a son named Adolf, and she really got tired of her husband. Her husband was taking her money and giving away her castles, and I mean, he treated her okay, but he was difficult. And even his estates, the people that helped him rule, got tired of him. They actually sent him on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for a few years to kind of get rid of him. But Catherine ended up conspiring with her son to knock her husband off of his ducal throne. And so her son ruled in his place. That's a really great story. Another one would be her sister Marie of Cleves. She married um, the Duke of Charles, Duke of Orleans, um, and he was a lot older than her. I mean, she was young, and he was in his probably in his 60s when she married him. But what's kind of interesting is after about 10 years, she had a child. People were kind of like, how did this happen? But really, nobody ever said anything about her son Louis, who eventually became King Louis XII of France. Nobody said that he was illegitimate. Nobody said he couldn't have the throne because of that. So I believe that she did have children with her husband. Um, it was just late in life. Another one of his granddaughters would be Philip of Guelders, who I really, really love her. She was the great great grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots.
I mean, I think it's just amazing these connections that you wouldn't expect from Burgundy, would you? You wouldn't expect all these connections to go on.
Yeah, that's what I found fascinating because I would look at the family tree and then I would be, okay, who's related to who. There's a historian named Sharon Jansen, and she's written a book called The Monstrous Regiment of Women, Female Rulers in early modern Europe. And she talks about how when you see family trees now, you see the men, you see all the men, and occasionally the women are mentioned as a wife, or if their daughter married someone important, that would show up on the tree. But let's look at the tree from the women's point of view. And then that really opens up a whole new vista.
What did you enjoy the most about writing this book?
I really, I think the research. Anytime I write a book, I enjoy the research. And in this case, since I don't speak Dutch or Flemish or German, it was a little hard to find sources in English, but I actually, I a part of the writing is writing, and then the other part is being a detective and Sherlock Holmes and, looking for sources. And I, when I was looking at Catherine of Burgundy, I just did a book search and I found a book in French from a library in Alsace-Lorraine that was published in like 1934 about her husband, Maximilian. And there was an entire chapter in there on his relationship with her. And oh, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. And so I hired someone to translate that chapter for me. I do speak French, but it's not good enough to translate, from a book. I also found a website where they had written down a bunch of scholars had written articles about many of these women, and that was very helpful. Now they were in Dutch, but we have Google Translate, so I was able to translate all of the articles and get the information. But I just got real excited going through that and, you know, being a detective and finding the sources.
It sounds like it was a really interesting period to research. It sounds like it was rich of sources and content.
Very. And like each story is different, each woman had a different angle to her story. And so it just made it really interesting.
Towards the end of the podcast, as you know, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So, since the last time you were on, have you got a new history pet peeve?
I do. And I just think it's because I think it's women are overlooked. They're just overlooked. A lot of times we don't have when they were born, we don't have when they died, we don't know where they're buried, we don't know their story at all. So I just think they're overlooked, and that's why I like to dig in and see what I can find and learn about their personalities.
If you could meet any historical figure, who would you meet and why?
Well, in relation to this, I think I would like to meet Isabel of Portugal. Like I said, she kind of sparked my interest in the Burgundian Empire. And also, she's kind of related to the Catherine of Braganza story because of the history of Portugal. Um, but I just think she was really formidable. She basically ruled for Philip a lot of the time in Burgundy, and she was very hands-on. She worked with all of the artisans in the area. She brokered trade treaties. She helped Philip raise money for the troops. She raised troops. I mean, she was really hands-on. She also helped to raise her son's daughter, Mary of Burgundy. So I think I would just really love to have dinner with Isabel of Portugal.
Have you got a favorite historical site that you've ever visited?
Yes. In 2016, I went on a tour of France and we went to Burgundy or Brittany. I'm sorry, Brittany. And I don't know, something just pulled at my heartstrings there. I just loved it. And we visited a Neolithic tomb there. That's the first time I'd ever been to one of those. And um, it's on my list to go back there someday.
If you could live in any historical era, when would it be and why?
I recently read two textbooks about queenship in Europe, and the first volume was early modern and medieval, and then the second volume was modern history. And when I was reading about these women in queenship and how women became, did their jobs, it just occurred to me that I thought I really liked medieval, but I'm really leaning more towards the early modern, because you love the Tudor period too. Um, that era really speaks to me. And even that time in France, there were so many great women. One of them is Anne of France, who was the daughter of King Louis XI. She's in the book too. She's something else. I mean, she ruled France for 8 years in the name of her brother. They didn't allow queens in France, but she was the queen of France, basically. So I think that era fascinates me the most.
I mean, I can't disagree with you. If I could go in the Tudor
Right.
period, there, see you later. Goodbye, 21st
Yeah.
century.
Yeah. Wouldn't you just love to be at a dance at Hampton Court Palace in that great hall? I mean, it's fabulous.
I'd like to be able to go in and out. Just before Henry notices me, he's like, I don't recognise you. Okay, right, disappear now. Like, just go through the portal. Have you got a favourite historical fact?
Well, this is something that I just recently figured out is that Mary Queen of Scots is a descendant of John the Fearless. I think that's so cool. Through
It's
his granddaughter, Philippa of Guelders, because her granddaughter was Marie of Guise, who was the mother of Mary Queen of Scots. So I sat down and I did a little family tree and showed how she was related to John the Fearless. And I'm sure there's plenty of others that are related to the Burgundian dukes, but that one just kind of fascinated me.
Thank you so much for coming back, first of all. It's always an honour when a guest comes back for the second time. And thank you for telling us so much about your wonderful new book.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.